Hello everyone and welcome to this RISA Tool introductory training.
Land acknowledgement. We would like to start by honoring the land that we are on, which has been stewarded by Indigenous people for thousands of years before colonial settlers. It is the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nations. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties and other agreements and is home to many Indigenous nations from across Turtle Island, including the Inuit and the Métis. These treaties include the One Dish with One Spoon and Wapen Belt Covenant, which are peace agreements to our collective responsibility to each other and the earth. Other Indigenous nations, settlers, and newcomers were invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We are mindful of broken covenants and ongoing colonization, and we strive to make this right with the land and with each other. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, or newcomers in this generation or generations past. We would like to also acknowledge those of us who came here forcibly. Particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, and we honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent. As Canadians, we must remain personally connected to our commitment to truth and reconciliation and work to bring justice to murdered and missing Indigenous women and their families across Turtle Island.
Today's training is going to start off by covering what risk assessment is and why it's important. I will then go over some of the risk factors that you'll find on the RISA tool, as well as some strategies for ongoing risk management. There will then be a short section covering some of the RISA tool research, and then, of course, using the RISA questionnaire, the risk factor report, and the safety plan. To start off, what is a risk assessment and why is it important? To better illustrate risk, we'll use a hypothetical case example. Alex is 22 years old and lives with her same-sex partner. The couple has lived together for 3 years. Alex disclosed that her partner has been emotionally abusive since they moved in together and was recently physically violent. Alex is thinking about leaving her partner, but is unsure because she recently lost her job and has no means to pay for her living expenses if she were to move out. She is currently isolated from her family due to homophobia and is reluctant to reach out to them for support. Alex is unsure what her legal rights and options might be for separating her from her partner. Before we move on to the next slide, please take a moment to reflect on some of the following questions. What about Alex's situation jumps out to you as potentially putting her at risk of future harm? And are there any safety considerations you can think of that might be particularly relevant to Alex's situation? Some of the risk factors that may have jumped out to you about Alex's situation include the fact that there was a recent escalation of violence, the fact that she's living with the abuser, and she's experiencing financial insecurity as well as isolation from social supports. In terms of safety considerations for Alex, you would definitely want to focus on increasing her social safety net, increasing her financial supports, as well as making sure she has an emergency safety plan in place. I'll cover a few definitions before we move on. Risk is the likelihood that violence will occur again in the future. Risk factors are the evidence-based circumstances, events, or characteristics that may place Alex at a higher risk of future violence. Risk assessment is an evaluation of the level of risk a survivor of IPV may be facing, including the likelihood of repeated or lethal violence. It can be based on a professional's judgment and experience in the field, or a structured interview or an assessment tool that often includes a checklist of risk factors. Doing a risk assessment can help you to know what kinds of questions to ask and what kinds of risk factors to look out for. The primary benefit of risk assessments is that they can help increase safety for survivors and their families and communities, and prevent future violence. They're also a way to benefit from past evidence and allow us to apply what we know about common patterns of violence and the factors that may lead to lethality or the escalation of violence. They also allow us to create personalized safety plans for survivors that account for their unique circumstances and risk factors that they're experiencing. Risk assessment tools play an important role in conducting a comprehensive risk assessment. Because they are meant to be systematic and evidence-based, tools can help us to identify signs or factors that we may otherwise miss if we're not sure what to look for. Tools also provide an understanding and a shared language about risk for service providers. According to our research, using validated tools can also help provide stronger evidence in the legal system, which can ultimately benefit survivors who are seeking legal justice. By definition, a safety plan is a written document that outlines practical steps that can be taken by the survivor and/or their support team to improve safety and reduce the risk of GBV. The plan includes vital information about the client's unique situation, risk factors, and needs, as well as concrete actions that can be taken. Elements of a safety plan could include emotional coping strategies, resources suited to the client's individual circumstances, and actions they can take, such as conveying information to friends and family. To be effective, safety planning should be personalized to the survivor's unique situation and needs, rather than using a general template. The risk assessment will determine what kind of safety strategies need to be considered and/or implemented, including any situations that might trigger future violence. This allows survivors to identify the escalation of violence or risk and have safety plans prepared in advance. Providers must also be aware in cases where the person causing harm is released on bail or probation, or situations where there's been an escalation of violence and harassment. In Alex's situation, her safety plan would need to take into consideration her lack of social supports and make sure she has a place to go in case of an emergency. We also have learning modules on risk assessment and safety planning in more detail on our website, riseaboverisk.ca, if you would like to learn more or refresh your knowledge. The next part of this training will review risk factors and risk management strategies. Most risk assessments are based on the identification of various risk factors. Risk factors can be categorized in multiple ways, which I will review now. Firstly, risk factors can either be dynamic, static, or victim-focused. Dynamic risk factors include personal circumstances and characteristics that are changing. It's crucial to note that the risk for violence can be influenced by context and can rapidly increase or decrease according to the change of circumstances, especially related to these dynamic risk factors. Because of this, risk assessment should be done on an ongoing basis. Static factors are those that do not change and describe a past circumstance or personal characteristic that is permanent. Victim-focused factors account for the survivor's own feelings and senses of danger and risk in a way that integrates their needs and vulnerabilities into the assessment. They allow the assessor to consider the life circumstances, social factors, and personal characteristics that might impact the choices and resources available to survivors, which are fundamental to safety planning strategies. Risk factors are also either validated or unvalidated, and the RISA questionnaire consists of both. Validated risk factors have been empirically studied against controls and have been found to be statistically significant in predicting future violence. Unvalidated factors are not statistically proven, but have been deemed significant by reports or literature or by the clinic. Lastly, some of the risk factors accounted for in the RISA tool are institutional and systemic. These factors are unvalidated, but account for aspects of identity and social location that can place survivors at a higher risk of GBV. So some examples of these factors include racism, education, housing, and the immigration system. There are multiple major risk factors for serious harm and lethality identified in the academic literature and research studies evaluated in the RISA project. The chart on the screen categorizes these factors based on whether they're dynamic, static, or victim-focused. The RISA risk factor report will list the risk factors, such as these, that your client is experiencing based on their answers to the questionnaire. Some of the dynamic factors include an actual or pending separation, coercive control, which can include acts of assault, threats, humiliation, and intimidation to isolate the survivor from support, and the perpetrator being depressed. Some static factors include the perpetrator having a history of domestic violence, prior threats to kill and/or harm the survivor, and prior threats or assaults with a weapon. Lastly, some victim-focused factors include the survivor's intuitive sense of fear and survivor vulnerability, which includes multiple factors such as mental health issues, addiction, disability, and language barriers. I'm now going to review how and when to conduct a risk assessment. An effective method of risk assessment involves combining your professional judgment and expertise along with a risk assessment tool, which will help you collect all of the relevant information. Personal interviews can be used to gather information for risk assessments. The RISA Tool questionnaire helps guide these personal interviews and ensures that you're covering all potential risk factors. Survivors' perception of risk should form a primary element of risk assessment. During the first meeting with your client, we recommend going through some of the RISA questionnaire to get a sense of your client's risk and provide them with some safety tips. Because of the length of the questionnaire, it may be overwhelming for clients to go through it all in one sitting, especially at the beginning of working with the service provider. You may find that it is better to go through the questionnaire over multiple sessions with a client, though it is really dependent on your situation and your client's comfort level. If you have limited time during a client session, you may want to break up the questionnaire over multiple sessions. However, if you're working in a shelter with clients who live there, you may have time to complete the whole questionnaire in the first session or in the first day or two. It's totally dependent on the situation and your professional judgment. You may also find you want to start from a different section of the questionnaire or jump around throughout it. You don't have to do it in order. It is also important to check in with your client during and after the risk assessment. Risk assessments can be very activating, and your client may need support during and after the assessment. Ask them how they're doing, whether they need anything, if they would like to do any grounding exercises, or if they want to take a break. As you continue to meet with clients, it is essential to continue to conduct risk assessments. You can complete the questionnaire in its entirety over a few sessions and then continue to follow up on relevant factors identified in the primary assessment. Please ensure you are following your organization's policies and protocols throughout this process. Applying a trauma-informed and survivor-centric approach to risk assessment and safety planning for survivors of GBV means understanding how trauma and GBV impacts their lives and behaviors. As you are assessing a survivor's perception of risk, please keep in mind that the impacts of trauma may have caused the survivor to become desensitized to their abuse and underestimate their risk. Service providers with knowledge of GBV and the effects of trauma can therefore play an important role in helping survivors plan for their safety and make informed choices in response to the potential escalation of abuse. A trauma-informed approach can also foster compassion when service providers engage with clients exhibiting negative behavior by helping them understand that these behaviors may be maladaptive coping mechanisms that were once helpful but have since become self-destructive or harmful. Being trauma and violence informed in the GBV context means shifting the question away from what's wrong with you toward asking what's happened to you. To learn more about trauma and trauma-informed methods of risk assessment, we highly recommend watching Learning Module 3 on the RISA website. This slide lists some principles for a trauma-informed approach. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but it's just to give you an idea of what a trauma-informed approach looks like in practice. Number 1, clients do not need to disclose their trauma to receive trauma-informed services. Number 2, the pervasiveness of trauma in society is recognized, so all services should be designed in a trauma-informed manner. Number 3, service delivery should prioritize client safety, choice, and control. Number 4, service providers can aim to model healthy relationships and boundaries with and for clients. Number 5, service providers should take steps to ensure that service provision does not re-traumatize clients. Number 6, service providers should obtain informed consent to proceed in relational work with the client. And number 7, providers should meet clients where they're at and provide choice in their healing. Risk assessment is only one part of a broader and ongoing risk management strategy to minimize future GBV. Risk management strategies consist of two main components: risk assessment and a strategy to minimize future harm. Minimizing harm involves safety planning for the survivor, effective risk communication, risk management strategies for the perpetrator, ongoing risk assessment, and collaboration between multiple agencies. Safety planning is the key risk management strategy for survivors. Although safety planning is extremely important, it is not the only component of risk management. Risk can still exist despite safety measures being taken by survivors. This is why it is essential that survivors are aware of the risks that they are facing, which requires effective risk communication. Risk management should be an ongoing and collaborative process. Multiple agencies responding to one situation are better at addressing multiple intersecting needs. Coordinated responses could include services such as specialist domestic violence services, women's groups, men's groups, police, lawyers, child protective services, culturally appropriate services, and health services. I'm now going to talk a little bit about some of the research that went into making the RISA tool. Though the RISA tool was released in September 2023, the clinic has been advancing risk assessment tools and practices for decades. In 2018, the clinic began a 2-year project funded by Law Foundation of Ontario and created the RISA Tool for the family court system. The clinic's 5-year national risk assessment project was launched in 2019 in collaboration with Women and Gender Equality Canada. The aim of this project was to build a blueprint for risk identification and safety planning founded on a trauma-informed approach and the consideration of intersecting identity factors for various groups who are disproportionately impacted by GBV. These groups include Indigenous women, Black women, racialized women, immigrant and refugee women, women with precarious immigration status, women with disabilities, 2 SLGBTQIA+ people, and gender diverse survivors. The clinic created the RISA tool for service providers and the Pedal Forward tool for survivors during this project, which wrapped up in the spring of 2025. The RISA tool, one of the major outcomes of this project, was soft-launched in September 2023. The interactive version of the RISA and Pedal Forward tools were launched in the spring of 2025. RISA was rated a 4.5 out of 5 stars by users, and there are currently 365 user accounts, and it's growing every day. There has also been over 100,000 views of the RISA and Pedal Forward websites to date. Just so you have a sense of everything that went into the development of RISA, it was quite extensive. Part of this project was a large-scale research initiative, which included an extensive literature review, consultations with 597 service providers across Canada, consultations with 38 survivors of GBV in Ontario, and the piloting of a risk identification and safety assessment tool with 220 service providers across Canada. This research allowed the clinic to identify risk factors related to IPV and GBV and to understand more about risk assessment methods, tools, and their limitations. The graphic on the screen shows some of the findings from our literature review, which found that risk assessment tools are not without their flaws. Many of the major tools focus primarily on perpetrator behavior and trying to predict future offenses and risks of future harm. While that's an important piece of the puzzle, most tools in their development have not had major input from survivors, nor have they been tested in actual service provider settings as part of risk assessment and safety planning with survivors. Most tools focus primarily on risk factors associated with physical violence or threats posed by the abuser. Other types of abuse and instances of power and control, such as psychological abuse and coercive control, are not included in most tools. Most tools also do not, in our assessment, consider systemic risk factors and barriers faced by equity-seeking groups, nor do they always use an intersectional approach in their design and implementation. They're often developed and tested in English and with heterosexual couples only. We also learned a lot from the service providers that we met with across the country and from our survey. First, we found lots of variation among service providers in terms of risk assessment knowledge, as well as the type and frequency of tools that are being used. Second, what we saw was not only a patchwork, but also a lot of adaptation work. Some used multiple tools depending on their situation. Some organizations also created their own internal tools drawing from existing tools. Some described adapting in the moment. For example, if a tool assumed a heterosexual relationship, they would modify the language in the moment when applying it to a client who identified as 2S/LGBTQIA. So perhaps, not surprisingly, there was a strong endorsement for this project and the RISA tool. We also learned a lot from survivors. The graphic on the screen highlights the main takeaways, and I'll just go over a few. First of all, survivors want to be consulted and have a lot to share about risk and safety mitigation. They also found a risk assessment with a trusted service provider really helpful. Some talked about how it helped them to recognize forms of risk that they were perhaps not ready to consider up until that point. But for it to be helpful, risk assessment had to be tied to very concrete safety planning and vital supports. And they wanted to see the diversity of their experiences better reflected in those safety plans, as well as in their interactions with service providers. They also felt overwhelmed by the nature and sequence of questions, and that the questions were too technical and too fast-paced. Survivors from our consultations also expressed that many of the tools they had experienced were not trauma-informed. They also emphasized the importance of emotional safety as part of the safety plan, and the need to have safety plans available in different formats and languages. RISA's extensive research and piloting ensured that survivors and service providers' voices were centered throughout each stage of RISA's development. We produced 2 research bulletins based on our findings from the consultations, one based on service provider knowledge and the other based on survivor knowledge. The links to these bulletins are posted in the video description. As I mentioned before, the National Risk Assessment Project wrapped up in the spring of 2025. However, the clinic recently received funding for a new risk assessment project called Resilient Together. This project builds on the clinic's National Risk Assessment Project and the RISA tool. Resilient Together is a 2.5-year initiative that will enhance risk assessment and case management services for survivors of gender-based violence across Ontario. The project is in partnership with the MCCSS Toronto Region VAW Service Systems Planning Table, or SSPT, and supported by over 25 agencies and networks across Ontario. It includes training and direct support for partner agencies to pilot and test the clinic's RISA tool at their organization. This project is what is allowing us to provide training on the RISA tool to organizations like yours across Ontario. A link to the project's website can be found in the video description and is also featured on the slide. I'm now going to present a demo of the RISA tool. Hello everyone, and welcome to this demo of the RISA tool. To start off, I'm going to walk you through the Rise Above Risk website and show you the different components that you can find on this website, and then we'll get into the tool itself. If you click on Explore Tool, you'll be directed to these different components. First, I want to start off by showing you our RISA framework. The RISA framework showcases the clinic's approach and understanding to risk. If you open the interactive framework, you'll see a larger photo where you can look through the different risk factors we've listed. This framework is based off of the work of Black and intersectional feminist scholars, and depicts how different levels of risk factors intersect to form the survivor's unique experience of risk. You can imagine the framework as starting from the center and building outwards. In the center, you'll see the survivor themselves and their unique characteristics and identities. The next ring looks at forms of GBV that the survivor is experiencing. You'll find things like physical violence, coercive control, and financial abuse. The next ring looks at social and interpersonal factors, which may intersect to put the survivor at a higher risk of GBV. This includes things like whether or not the survivor has children, pets, and what their social supports look like. The last ring looks at institutional and systemic factors, which will also intersect to form a unique experience of risk for the survivor. For example, if the survivor is experiencing racism, sexism, or ableism, they may be at a higher risk of violence due to the oppression of these systems. You can also hover over these purple dots to look at definitions of some of the different factors. The next component of the Rise Above Risk website are the learning modules. There are 3 different learning modules available for different stages of knowledge. Module 1 looks at some of the basics of GBV, and this is intended for service providers who are newer to the field. Module 2, Foundations of Risk Assessment and Safety Planning, goes into depth about what risk assessment and safety planning look like. And then Module 3 looks at intersectional risk factors, as well as trauma-informed approaches to risk management. And then, of course, we have the RISA questionnaire, which forms the center of the RISA tool itself. I'm going to click on Start Assessment, and you find that you'll be redirected to this page. Now, there's a few things that may jump out at you here. You'll see this Launch Tool button, but you'll also see these different icons below and options to download PDFs. The RISA tool comes in 2 different versions, the manual tool, which you can find at the bottom of the screen, and the online tool, which is linked here. The manual tool comes in 4 different steps. Step 1 is the questionnaire, Step 2 is a risk factor worksheet, Step 3 is the safety plan, and Step 4 is the action plans. All of the components of the tool are the same on the online tool, but the main difference between the 2 is that the manual version is done either by hand or on a PDF, and you just have to translate the answers you get on the questionnaire to the risk factor worksheet to identify the risk factors your client is experiencing, and then based on those risk factors, you can find the safety planning sections that are most relevant to your client. The online tool, on the other hand, automatically generates a risk factor report and a safety plan based on the questionnaire responses. But it's totally up to you which version you choose to use. For today's purposes, I will be showing the online tool. If you hit the Launch Tool button, you'll be directed to a different website, which is the tool website. I'm going to quickly log out to show you what the login page looks like. If you need to create an account, just click on the Register button, enter your organizational email address, your name, and create a password. Then click Register. I'm going to quickly log in to show you what the tool interface looks like. When you log in, you'll be taken to this profile page. There's not much going on here, as most of the tool's components live under My Dashboard. If you click on My Dashboard, you'll see that there are some instructions at the top on how to use the tool. When you scroll down, you'll see different components of the dashboard. You'll have the RISA ID number on the left. This is important to note down every time you start a new questionnaire, because this is going to be how you identify what questionnaire belongs to what client. The RISA tool doesn't collect any personal identifying information, so the only way that we keep track of risk assessments is using the RISA ID number. So we suggest you write this ID number down in your client record systems or your files or however you keep track of your clients. Then you have a start date, which notes the date that you opened the questionnaire. There's also an expiry date. However, please disregard this as it is no longer a feature and the questionnaire will not expire. Then there's a status column, and then you'll see the questionnaire, the risk factor report, and the safety plan. I'll start by opening up a new questionnaire. You'll see at the top there's some more instructions for yourself and reminders to prepare yourself and your client for the assessment. Then you'll see the RISA ID number and a reminder to note it down. Then you'll see the 5 different sections of the RISA questionnaire. I'll open up section 1 to give you an idea of what it looks like. At the top, you'll see a short description of what the section is asking about and why. This can be really helpful to provide your client with an explanation behind why you're asking the questions that you're asking, as well as informative for you as the service provider. There's also a suggested script for service providers, which you can use as a guide to just remind you to do the conversation in a more conversational tone rather than more of an interview format. Just a reminder to remind your client so that they can skip any questions they need to. You can repeat any questions, that the assessment is voluntary, and they can always take a break. Then there's a prompt, which also serves a similar purpose. It's a way of introducing the client to the question that's about to be asked. Please use these only if they're helpful to you, and just use them as a guide to remind you to administer the questionnaire in a slightly more trauma-informed way. Then you'll find the question itself, and underneath some multiple choice answers. There's also a comments and notes box under each question, which you can note down any additional relevant information that comes up in your discussion. Section 1 asks about the client's current living situation, but there's also 4 other sections of the questionnaire. For the purposes of the time of this demo, I'm not going to go through every single question, but I'll talk about what each section covers. Section 2 looks at relevant identity factors, so this will include things like the client's age, their gender identity, and their immigration status. Section 3 asks about types of violence the client is experiencing. So this will cover things like coercive control, physical abuse, and emotional abuse. Section 4 asks questions about the person who caused harm. So it'll ask about things like whether the individual has any mental health disorders, substance abuse issues, or any recent life-changing circumstances. And then lastly, Section 5 looks at institutional and systemic factors. So this covers things like whether or not the client has any issues accessing services, if they have any hesitations about accessing certain types of services based on their identity. Once you complete the questionnaire, you can either click Generate Report or Save Draft. And please note, you do not have to complete the whole questionnaire in one setting. Many service providers find that it's better to go through the questionnaire over multiple different sessions and go through a few questions at a time. Regardless of whether or not you choose to complete the entire questionnaire in one setting or over multiple sessions, you can press either Save Draft or Generate Report. If you hit Generate Report, you'll get the safety plan and the risk factor report. But if you hit Save Draft, it'll save the questionnaire and you can come back and edit it later. You can also edit it even if you press Generate Report, so no worries if you want to change some answers or you want to come back and ask some more of the questions. Regardless of which one you press, you'll be taken back to the dashboard, and if you scroll down, you'll see the most recent questionnaire at the bottom of your dashboard. I'm going to open up a risk factor report based on a questionnaire I've already completed as a test to show you what it might look like. At the top, you'll find some instructions about what the report is and what its purpose is for. This report's purpose is to help you make a professional judgment about the client's level of risk. It does so by listing out all of the different risk factors that your client is experiencing based on the way that they answered the questionnaire. And it'll break down the risk factors into 3 different clusters. Cluster 1 looks at risk factors for serious harm and lethality. Cluster 2 looks at risk factors for potential reassault. And Cluster 3 looks at additional factors. This includes systemic and institutional factors that are not currently validated by research, but were still identified in the Schlifer Clinic's research as being relevant to a holistic assessment of a survivor's unique circumstances. You can use this chart to help you make a professional judgment about your client's level of risk. However, it's not designed to be shared with clients directly. Though it is important to communicate your client's risk factors to them, it's up to you how you choose to do so. So for example, this individual is experiencing multiple cluster 1, 2, and 3 risk factors, meaning that they're likely at a high risk of future harm. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll also see a section where you can make a professional judgment. So feel free to note down any thoughts that come up as you look at this report, and you can always save this report in your own records to make sure you have a record of this judgment. Also, any comments or notes that you write during the questionnaire will appear in this column. And then there's also the safety plan. I'm going to open up the safety plan that corresponds with the risk factor report we just looked at. At the top, you'll see a gray box with instructions for service providers only. If you scroll down, you'll also see this header here. Underneath this header, all of the language is designed to be worded towards the client. So if you would like to, you can print this or download it and send it to the client directly. If you do so, the gray box at the top will not be downloaded or printed. Then you'll see the contents header. Under this header, you have 4 different categories of safety strategies, which are included in every survivor's safety plan, regardless of their answers to the questionnaire. That's because we believe that these safety planning strategies are important for all survivors to keep in mind. If you scroll down further, you'll see this table. Factors relevant to my situation, and underneath it will list the risk factors identified on the questionnaire that are specific to your client. You'll also see a personalized safety strategy section related to that particular risk factor. So for example, if the individual is living with the person causing harm, they will get if when living with the person who caused harm as a safety planning section on their unique safety plan. If you click on the content link like I just did, it'll direct you to that specific portion of the safety plan. I encourage you to review the safety plan as well as the questionnaire in more detail before going through it with a client, so you become aware of what questions may be most relevant to ask your clients when you're able to skip around throughout the questionnaire, and you also know what parts of the safety plan may be most relevant to the populations that you're working with. If you go back to my dashboard, the last component I'll show you today is the action plan. You can open up the action plan by hitting Download Action Plan, and it'll take you to this PDF. There are 3 different RISA action plans listed here, and the action plans are really meant to serve as a guide for your risk management strategy after that first meeting and first risk assessment with a client. The first action plan consists of some follow-up questions that you may want to ask your client to make sure that you've covered everything and that their safety plan is realistically implementable for them. For example, these include questions such as what kinds of supports they have, making sure that they have a place to go if they need to leave in an emergency. The second action plan is an action plan for case and risk management. So this consists of reflection questions for the service provider to ask themselves after an initial risk assessment with a client. These include things like if the notes are complete, asking yourself what kind of follow-up is needed and what kind of referrals need to be made and what the timeline for that might be. And then there's also a referral sheet here which you can use to keep track of referrals if it's helpful to you. Lastly, there's a high-risk case consultation and action plan. And this consists of questions to ask frontline staff from supervisors in cases that are identified as high risk. I will point out a couple more things on this website before I finish this demo. If you scroll down, you'll see that there's a survey here. You can use this to give us your feedback. We always want to hear from you about things that you're liking about the tool, things that you would like to see in a next version of the tool. And then there's also this language component here, which you can use to automatically translate the tool into any of these languages. This is a Google Translate plugin, so the translation might not be 100% accurate. However, it should still be helpful in making the translation process easier for clients. If there's any languages you would like to see the tool translated in that aren't listed here, please give us an email or fill out the feedback form. Thank you so much for listening to this demo, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the training. As I mentioned in the demo, you can use the RISA questionnaire in different ways depending on your setting. Because it may need to be adapted, it's important to familiarize yourselves with the questions ahead of time so that you can skip to a different question or section or prioritize certain questions based on the client's situation if needed. It's also important to familiarize yourself with the content of the safety plan before using the tool with a client, because there may be certain portions of the plan you'll want to emphasize based on their situation. The other next step is to create a RISA Tool account by going to www.risaboverisk.ca. Thank you so much for viewing this training. We really appreciate your time and commitment to RISA. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the RISA project email, which is also posted in the video's description. Have a great day.